everyone. My name is Jonah Davids, and I'm the producer of the CSPI podcast. I'm filling in for Richard to introduce this episode, which was originally recorded for Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning podcast. In the episode, Richard and Razib discuss the Israel-Palestine conflict, wokeness, culture and institutions, Chinese dominance in the 21st century, public health failures following COVID-19, and what it's like to run a think tank. Enjoy!
I'm here with a repeat guest for some of you, Dr. Richard Hanania. And, if you don't know about Richard, you are not paying close attention. Since the last time I talked to him, which was like 6 months ago, and I would say I talk to Richard fairly frequently. Just he gives me a different heterodox perspective. He's always funny, and interesting, whether you agree with him or disagree with him. But he's kind of blown up. A lot has happened. He's said a lot of things and gotten a lot of reaction. And so I'm excited to talk to him about Israel, Palestine, American culture, and whatnot, politics. Richard, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Richard Hanania. I'm the president of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology, a new think tank doing a lot of interesting work. And I am also a research fellow at Defense Priorities, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I have my own Substack. I just like to look for avenues to share my opinions. So that's pretty much what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you almost do provocation arbitrage. I think you provoke. I think you provoke people in a good way. You go where angels fear to tread. Although sometimes, if those of you who follow Richard's Twitter, follow it and watch closely because he will delete some of the best tweets. Okay, the best stuff is like an Instagram whatever story.
Don't tip people off. Come on, now people are going to go and try to catch me.
In any case, all right. So Israel and Palestine, I want to talk to you about this because you sometimes tweet things a little against the American grain, I think. Like a lot of Americans, it's just kind of something in the background of our lives. As we're recording right now, Bibi is no longer prime minister, which is the first time in like a dozen years. He's kind of been, a generational figure from the 90s for a little while, and then he kind of came back in the 2000s or late 2000s. So there was some conflict, there was some battle lines. Okay, we know what the top line, of this all is. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's our ally. We need to love Israel as much as the U.S. Also, the Palestinians are oppressed, marginalized people. They are the most oppressed people in the world. I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but these are the cutouts that I see from both sides. So, can you tell us what your perspective is, just so that we get something a little bit different here?
Yeah, I mean, so my main area of focus and expertise is in international relations, and I'm a Palestinian. So you might think I have strong opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I really don't. I mean, I think that what the people on the Israeli side will say is that the Palestinians don't want to or don't have the capacity to make peace. What the Palestinians will say is that Israel is occupying their land and kick them off their land and is engaging in a form of ethnic cleansing in certain areas in East Jerusalem. And both of them are both of those perspectives are pretty much right. And there's not much intellectually interesting about the problem of Israel Palestine because it's been sort of in a stalemate for decades and decades. I mean, how do conflicts end? I mean, one side crushes the other often, and so that's that's not going to happen. Israel is not going to do that for political reasons. Even the U.S., which is somewhat was very differential to Israel, is probably going to give them some problems if they try to do that. There's internal resistance to that within Israel, and then sometimes you have a dictator who just forces one side to make peace. I mean, when Egypt and Jordan and when these countries made peace with Israel, I don't think there was popular support for it, but they were dictators who could basically tell their countries what to do. They have in the Palestinian in Gaza. You had you had Hamas come to power. So they're a revolutionary movement. Their ideology is not going to allow them to make peace. So we're basically, this is what it's going to be for a very long time. I think if you just summed up the history a decade ago, I don't think it looks much different than today. 2 decades ago, I don't think it didn't look much different. Today, it doesn't look much different. I think eventually you could get sort of a right-wing radicalization of Israeli society. It's happening gradually, but because of the demographics, because of the ultra-Orthodox having so many kids, I think you'll get to the point where Israel just sort of does the more sort of strenuous kind of ethnic cleansing thing and doesn't really care what the rest of the world thinks. That's not going to happen probably in the immediate future. But that's the only real way I see this thing eventually ending.
Well, I mean, what would you say to my contention that Israel started out a settler colonial state, but it's turning into a Middle Eastern state?
So a Middle Eastern state in this, well, I mean, in the sense that how do you mean that?
So it was predicated on a sort of European, I don't want to say linguistic nationalism, but the Jewish nationalism, secular Jewish nationalism, the alignment movement, that labor came out of and whatnot. And then over time, the arrival of massive numbers of Mizrahi, Sephardic, and Yemeni Jews kind of introduced a new element of, it's not necessarily accurate or precise to call them Arab Jews, but they were Jews from, Araby, the Arab lands. And so these are not people that went through the European experience. And over time, you have these ultra-Orthodox, these Haredi that are growing in numbers, as well as the rise and coalescence of a national religious sentiment, which is kind of like a little different than anything that existed in the early 20th century. And these elements are not out of a European national tradition from the 19th century. Something like the Haredis, I think they resemble some sort of, like the Shia minority in Lebanon. They're more. You can imagine them more like that. Like, that's what I'm trying to say.
So yeah, I mean, these are. I mean, I think. I mean, it's just simpler to say it's gone from a secular, more of a secular nation state to more of a religious state. That just might be the most simple, explanation of what's going on, and it's differential for fertility. I think that's happened actually in a lot of places across the Middle East. But yeah, there's definitely a transition, and the idea that for what I'm talking about, whether they would, the sort of the means through which they deal with the minority ethno religious rival, within their borders or across their borders. I don't know if there's much of a difference in the way that a Middle Eastern state and a ethno nationalist, early 20th century European state would deal with that. I mean, the ethno nationalist European state, before say the post World War, before the Second World War. I mean, I think they would have dealt with their opponents pretty harshly. But yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, there is certainly an evolution into a more religious state, and yeah, with all that entails. I mean, there's too many differences to go into.
Well, I mean, it could be in 30 to 40 years. We couldn't imagine gay pride marches in Tel Aviv. I think you are a little skeptical about some of the likud hawks in the United States. Just for the international listeners out there, there is a fraction of the Republican Party, which is really, and I do, lean to the right myself personally, but I will say it's just a little strange to me about how they seem to place Israel right next to the United States as if their loyalties are equal to both. And, I think you kind of like to poke fun at that. I mean, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the worthlessness of the American conservative movement is sort of a theme throughout my work, and one of the symptoms of this is their slavish devotion to Israel. I mean, I don't think it's a voter. I mean, I don't think it's as much. It's somewhat of a popular support thing, but it's mostly a donors thing, and it's mostly they get excited when they can call the Democrats anti-Semitic because Democrats are always calling them intolerant, racist, or sexist, or homophobes. So the one thing that they get to call Democrats is anti-Semitic. So I think they just really, really indulge in being sort of the PC enforcers for once. And then you have the donors and the power seeking, and it really is pathetic. I mean, there was a couple weeks ago, there was Netanyahu was posting on his Twitter account just like different like Republican senators who were coming up to him and like groveling to him. So one was like Lindsey Graham, and he says he gives Lindsey Graham, I don't know, like a certificate or something, or like something to like show like he's a friend of Israel, and like Lindsey Graham holds it up like he's like a 5-year-old, and like he just got a cookie or something, and then Netanyahu sort of rolls his eyes at the camera like, oh my god, this guy is contemptible, like he just embarrassed him, and so this stuff happens a lot. And there was one with Ted Cruz, where the U.S. pays for Israel's Iron Dome, and then Ted Cruz says, thank you, Mr. Netanyahu, for all you do. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you for Iron Dome. And Netanyahu's like, no, thank you. I mean, the thing was paid for by the U.S. And so these guys are just, they're just completely embarrassing. I mean, they don't, they run on certain things and they complain about certain things that have popular support. And when they get into power and what they show they really care about, it's something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting from you is, do you think that this will just kind of continue until it evolves and just fades into, Israel will solve its Palestinian problem, so to speak, by just not having Palestinians within the borders of Israel? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, no, I think, I don't know if I don't know if they're gonna kick out the Palestinians who are already there. But I think there's gonna be, I think there's just gonna be less, I think there's probably gonna be harsher responses to, say, missiles coming from Gaza. I think you're gonna see, like, less concern with humanitarian things, and if there is. But Israel's a first world country, so you can have restive minorities in a first world country, and that doesn't have to ever be solved, right? You could just that could just be an equilibrium that goes on forever. And you see some of this, I mean, with the Arab like Gulf states, like during the Trump administration, just giving up on the Palestinians, not liking it, just not caring. The UAE and these other countries, and the Saudis, but although the Saudis didn't officially normalize relations, so the region, I mean, with the exception of Iran, has sort of moved on from the Palestinian cause. I think, I think that even if the U.S. turns against Israel, it's hard to imagine, but you can imagine a very left-wing administration. What could the U.S. do? I mean, the U.S. gives a lot of aid, but the aid is not decisive, right? They don't need the U.S. aid to put down the Palestinians or to defend their national security. So yeah, I think this is probably going to continue for a few decades. I think Israeli society will continue moving to the right. There'll probably be harsher measures against the Palestinians, and I don't, if we talk in 10 years about this, I don't know if it'll be much different.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like we could have a similar conversation 10 years ago. So, I think there's not that much daylight between us on this, to be honest. Both kind of informed by a certain cynicism. I'm older than you, but I've just seen this happen decade after decade. It never ends. It never changes in a fundamental, deep, structural way. And these politicians just keep talking and talking and talking about it, and I think a lot of people are sick of it. So I want to move on to, this wasn't on the agenda really when I contacted you, but your piece, Woke Institutions is Just Civil Rights Law, on your Substack, has really blown up. It got you all over the Twitters, all over the social media, and I think you've gotten on the TV. You've gotten Richard Hanania in 2D, in full color, or maybe not too much color, but in any case, that's a different issue. So this is a big deal. Why conservatives won't and can't fight for influence and what to do about it. Follow up to why everything is liberal. And so talk about it. Give the listeners a précis of what's going on here, what you propose, and what the reaction's been.
Okay, so wokeness is like all Republicans talk about. So the CPAC conference this year, for the international listeners, that's the yearly conference of conservative activists. It was called America Uncanceled. That was that was the slogan of the conference, right? You could the way they make their pitch to the electorate during the Trump campaign, the RNC. I mean, all they talk about is cancel culture. They talk about wokeness. You watch Fox News, it's woke outrage after woke outrage. Oh, Mr. Potato Head is now going to be gender neutral. supernatural. Oh, the the Lucky Charms leprechaun is going to be transgender. I mean, it's stuff like that all day. I don't think that one has actually happened, but it's like something you could imagine happening, right?
Yeah.
It's just like really, really, it's just this stuff all day. And I don't like the cultural changes. I mean, I agree with I agree with the sort of this critique. And unfortunately, there's like, if we debate healthcare, if we debate taxes, it's like one side wants to raise taxes, one side wants to lower taxes, one side wants to expand healthcare coverage, or one side doesn't want to expand healthcare coverage. So there's like, there's a clear idea of what each side wants to do. And conservatives don't have that. I mean, they have this thing that is the center of their, their appeal to the electorate, and the center of sort of what's motivating a lot of people to go into politics. And there's just nothing there. Now, I think that this has just been a conceptual mistake. I think people are ignoring, the large fact, and they're ignoring it. I think for if we could talk about why later. But what they're ignoring is basically woke institutions has been the law. So civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 said you can't discriminate based on race. So through a combination of what bureaucrats were doing, what judges were doing, what the presidents in the 60s and what LBJ and Nixon did through executive orders, what that turned into was a series of steps which basically said institutions have to believe that disparities are caused by discrimination, that you're not allowed to have that another view. The federal government forces you, if you want to contract with the federal government, they force you to count your employees by race and by gender and make sure there are no disparities, right? That's up to you. That's your responsibility. Every government and every department of the federal government has to do the same thanks to these executive orders. On the rest of the private sector, there's, like I said, disparate impact. If you're doing anything, if you want to give an intelligence test, if you want to give a fitness exam, and one group does better than the others, that's also a sign of discrimination. So what happens? So they said this is sort of vague because like everything has a disparate impact. So like you don't really know like what's legal or not, and so you become very risk averse. You develop an HR bureaucracy. So I have data on the number of people working in human resources from like the 1960s to today. People working in, they used to call them affirmative action or equal employment offices. They had these in corporations. Now, there'll be diversity, inclusion, equity. These things take off in the 1960s. Why do they take off? Because people need to keep up with the law. They need to have a defense if they ever go and they're being sued, right? And so and the EEOC, which is the arm of the government that's enforcing this stuff, gets some really, really big settlements, right? It goes after some corporations, right? It gets huge settlements. It sends a message to the rest of industry, and and there's also a concept of hostile work environment, which basically says, if somebody finds something offensive, that can be part of a pattern that can establish culpability for a lawsuit. So what is wokeness? Wokeness is just the idea that disparities are caused by discrimination. We don't care about all disparities, right? We care about whites doing better than some other group. We care about men doing better than women, but disparities where women do better than men, no one cares about. So it's the restriction on speech that's also part of wokeness, and the full-time bureaucracy, I think, is also key to wokeness. You see these protests on college campuses, and they'll often, one of their demands will be like hire 5 new diversity trainers. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's a really, really strange movement. They just want to sort of talk to you about your thought crimes forever. And this is all either law or it's traceable to law. If a look, I put it like this: if you take like an article from, say, City Journal, or maybe the more edgy stuff even from National Review, and on race and gender, you see some kind of article like that, and like a CEO just expressed the views in that article, that's borderline illegal, right? So conservatism is basically sort of illegal in institutions. I mean, it's iffy, and there's a lot depends on the interpretation of the regulator and the judge, but businesses and institutions tend to be risk averse. And so what happens is what you end up with is basically every institution looks like, what we see today. They're all woke. There's no risk in being woke. I mean, there is, you could alienate customers, but there's no legal risk, right, from doing that. And there's no way to be basically a conservative institution without painting a huge target on your back. So I was sort of frustrated how directly related this stuff is to policy and how little people seem to realize that. And I mean, the reaction, I mean, it's the libertarians love it. People are always like, oh, we are the new right, and libertarians are just weak and they refuse to do anything about, wokeness. But no, the libertarian, I mean, this lined up perfectly with what libertarians believe, because they think government is bad, and they don't like anti-discrimination laws. And so Brian Kaplan, said it was like, like the best article I'd ever written. And, people like that really liked it. Reason Magazine, I think liked it, and then or Reason Magazine might have liked the one or two of the articles before that, and then like the people on the populist right liked it too, like the American Mind reprinted the article, and some liberals had like tepid criticism. I think Iglesias said, if this is he said this could be like a new fusionism between the the basis of a new. He said, I'm hearing so much, praise for this from libertarians. This could be the basis of a return to fusionism with the anti-PC right and the libertarians coming together. And then some people said, some people had tepid criticism. Some people said, oh, it's just Jim Crow. These were the stupider, among the stupider commentators. But yeah, I mean, I think I think taking this healthy energy of like not liking what's going on, and turning it into something positive that you could actually do about it. I think that's something we should encourage. And if you think there's nothing you could do about it, just stop talking about it. Don't have a political party focused on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me, as we are recording right now. I'm hearing that like I saw a friend, an old friend that I've known for many years, wonder why CRT is being talked of so much. It's in a weird academic thing, and this friend doesn't have children, and he never plans to have children. And I just kind of basically said, well, it's affected our family, and I'm not going to give personal examples because my children have their privacy, and so I'm not going to just say what happened to them and what happened to our family. But it's affecting us. It's not, they're not reading Kimberly Crenshaw or whatever. I don't know, all these different things. I don't care what these things are. But it's affecting the culture. So conservatives, going back to, well, not just going back to, but Andrew Breitbart family said, you know, politics is downstream of culture, right? Are you kind of saying the reverse?
Yeah, I think the reverse is true. I think that's a little bit of a little bit of a cope. I think power ultimately drives culture more than the. I mean, they're obviously they co-evolve and they work together. But I think every case has to be taken on a case by case basis. I think in this case though, you could trace from civil rights interpretation of the civil rights law to the rise of HR and bureaucracy. You could trace that, and I do that in my paper pretty clearly. And you talked about critical race theory. Why is it being taught in schools? Look, there's all these fads that come along. So there used to be the implicit association test. All about the replication crisis and all that. It turned out to be nonsense, but it was promoted by these corporations. They just want to make money and they don't want to be sued. And like fads come along, and there's just a market for it because they're basically looking for defenses, right? When the EEOC or some lawsuit comes after them, and they're not social scientists, they don't know what's going on, right? So they're just like pulling things off the shelf, and this opens up opportunities for entrepreneurs. So the implicit association does that thing where you see a picture of a white face and a picture of a black face, and you see which one you're more positive. It's all been debunked. It's all nonsense. But that was in the corporate world for a while. And so you have Robin DiAngelo, critical race theory training, and people say, oh, there's a difference, academic critical race theory versus the populism. Yeah, of course, but it's pretty much the same, the same ideas at the core. And yeah, I mean, one thing courts do is they say, or regulators do, is that they say they adopt a best practices approach. So if they want to know if you're practicing enough affirmative action for a government contract or you're having a non-discriminatory environment, they want to see that you're doing what other people are doing. They don't care about evidence. None of these people are social scientists. Nobody cares about evidence, right? You're just trying to basically get by. You create these bureaucracies within the corporation, the DEI people and the HR people. They have their own views and they start to have their own interests. And so, yeah, critical race theory. I mean, it's something I think it's ugly and evil, like many people say, and I wholeheartedly support efforts to ban it in whatever form you can. But it's part of a larger story, and when it goes away, if it goes away, something else will come later if you don't deal with the root of the problem.
And so, is this kind of a hopeful message?
Yeah, I think so. Look, it's executive orders. You could get rid of affirmative action in the federal government. And look, we haven't. Nobody's tried it. This is the thing. It's like there is a path, and Republicans have been talking about democratizing Iraq and taxes and guns, for years. And you know what? The things that they've talked about and the things they've actually cared about, they've went to bat for. Tax cuts, their precious wars, and a lot of the stuff's been, and the gun laws. Sometimes something will have 90% support, some kind of gun control measure, and it won't get passed just because the Republicans have political power and they're so so united on this issue. So yes, I have hope that politics can do something. It hasn't been tried in this area, and there's a it's indirect. I'm trying to get a culture through law, and it didn't happen overnight. Where these broad interpretations of civil rights law led to sort of where we are today. It was decades, and there was society had to sort of evolve in a certain direction. So it wouldn't change the culture overnight. You'll still have your Mr. Potato Head and Dr. Seuss stories for a while, no matter what. But you take the sort of the boot off the neck of institutions. You create fewer opportunities for the civil rights commissars, and hopefully you just hope for in a few decades good things happen.
Okay. That's pretty positive. I mean, depending on what your political orientation is, I know some of the listeners, they might be alarmed by this. They might love critical race theory. I don't know. So but it's definitely like resetting the terms of the debate. I do think a lot of conservatives, to be frank, myself, we've been pretty pessimistic and bearish, and this is kind of like, okay, we might be able to do something about this.
Yeah, I'm bearish. Like, it's like they have to listen to me, and then they have to win this political fight, and then they have to wait and hope it evolves in a way that it works, right? But at least there's a path. That's all I'll say. It's a lot.
Yeah. And so I want to ask you about your United States. United States year 2040, United States year 2099. Like, do you have any thoughts on what you think the most likely outcome of the various demographic and cultural forces are going to be in this country?
2099, I wouldn't trust anybody who tried to forecast that far into the future. 2040, I guess, is not that far. I think, I think I think there's deep structural things what's going on with American politics. I think that we're a rich society, we're a highly divided society, and we are divided by that there's an established conservative media and there's established liberal media. And I think this, I mean, and people tend to think, people see instability. So this is what we talked about before, me versus Peter Churchin. And Peter Churchin said, we're more likely than not going to have a civil war. And I said no. And I think, it's been like a year since we've had that debate. And I think I'm clearly, I think it's looking more like I was right. And I think that I'm going to continue to be right on that. I think the system is stable. I mean, I think when you have people fighting over, sort of symbolic things, and you have these institutions. I mean, and the institutions are strong. I mean, they're strong in the sense they preserve themselves. There was when the internet popped up, and social media popped up, and there was a time when the New York Times and the Washington Post were losing readers, and you could think that they would go away and they'd be replaced by Alex Jones and Joe Rogan being the most important people in American politics. I mean, it looked like we could have been heading in that direction for a little while, but then they censored people like Alex Jones and the people who are far right, and Joe Rogan. I mean, he's still around. He's doing doing the Spotify thing now. But basically, they adjusted, the power adjusted. So the New York Times and Washington Post have more readers now than ever. They were losing influence for a while. Now it's just going through the roof. And part of it was they basically, they leaned on, they and their and politicians leaned on Silicon Valley, the tech companies, to sort of rework their algorithms, right? So you wouldn't find the so-called dangerous stuff at the top of it, and they started deciding what was credible news, what was not credible news, and they started gaming the system in their favor. So I think the lesson of that. So like, there was a point where I think if you kept like the Google algorithm what it was in like 2012, or and YouTube, what it was around that time. I don't know if YouTube was big in 2012, but I think if you kept like the pre 2015 internet and just sort of let things develop, you could have had some radical things happen. But they, power adjusted, and it's still the biggest, the biggest, influencers are still, so New York Times, CNN, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the establishment, which is mostly the same people, or the same kind of people. And so I don't think we're in a situation where we're going to see radical change in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, I think that's the greatest extent possible. We're going to be, I think America's going to, the system is pretty stable. I think that the rise of China is going to, potentially have a psychological impact. It's the, the projections are it'll have 2 or 3 times the economy of the U.S. by, say, like 2050. I think that a lot of people are looking for reasons to think China's going to collapse or fall, or this used to be the idea that they would democratize. That's going away. The people used to believe they would collapse. I mean, I think that's becoming less credible, despite Gordon Chang still, being on TV, promoting his book. I think if they get their birth rates up, and that looks like they're going to start like actually making that a huge priority, I think it could be quite shocking to the United States, because like the last like cope they have of like American, maintaining its edge. And even with the demographic projections, China's still going to be a bigger economy. But the idea that it's going to have sort of long term unable to keep up, while U.S. has this immigration system that lets people in. Some people are pessimistic about that, but I think the mainstream view is okay. So the demographics are being replenished. I think if China gets the birth rate up, I think it's going to be, people are going to look at, they're going to say, this is, we've lost our spot. And I don't know, like how, and you could imagine like a showdown over Taiwan or something. And, the idea that China is going to have twice the economy of the U.S. and the U.S. is going to be able to like, beat it in a war in its own backyard. I think that's very naive. I think that's, and I think would be crazy to try. I think we'd be crazy to, go to war over Taiwan or something. So you could imagine some showdown where the U.S. Backs down and there's something that happens. But then like, I think back to like Hong Kong, and like, how people were like all on Twitter and like were like I stand with Hong Kong, and they just crushed the democracy movement, right? I mean, they just and now we don't remember Hong Kong. And so Taiwan could be the same thing. Maybe we're just so in our bubble, nothing can psychologically sort of burst it. I think everything gets wrapped up in the same narrative, and we still sort of think America's the best, but we also think like the other side is either Nazis or like woke crazy totalitarians who are destroying the country. But there's still this idea that like still America's better than everyone else in the world. And yeah, I think there's going to be more of that in the future.
Well, so you have a piece. You're talking about China. You have a piece. Why most China analysis is just cope. I do have to say, Richard, your Substack. You're good with the titles. You're good with the topics. Definitely, I can see. People are probably clicking through to read this stuff. I think I pretty much agree with a lot of your points, and I want you to like just summarize it for the listener in a bit. But one question I do have about China is its workforce, its labor force is going down. It has serious issues with its future dependency ratio. I wonder if that's going to be just a major drag on its rise to prominence. I mean, the peak of American power was during the baby boom, arguably. Well, maybe baby boom, and then also maybe the late 1990s, right? I don't know how you measure that. But our demographics were not nearly as concerning, I guess, back then. So, I mean, I know you said that, they want to turn around their birth rate, but I mean, Singapore tried to turn around its birth rate. Now, Singapore is not like an apples to apples comparison. It's a city-state. But, countries that have tried to turn around their birth rate have had a really difficult time. So that's the main issue where I'm just like, these are serious headwinds.
Yeah, so I mean, the way we talk about the birth rate issue, I mean, I think, I don't know if you remember, like 5-10 years ago, people were saying similar things about Russia. A lot of countries have low birth rates when they, developing in a developed world. And it's, it's when people don't, when people in America or analysts don't like the country, they make it into a much bigger problems than you might think it should be objectively. So like when you're talking, so it depends on what you're talking about. So if you're talking about China and like relative to Taiwan's demographics are worse. Taiwan's birth rate is lower. Nobody says Taiwan will never be able to defend itself because it has no birth rate, so it's just going to be like half the size, in a few generations. So that's something you have to remember. If you're talking about China relative to a lot of its neighbors, a lot of its neighbors are in the same position or worse. And then as far as whether China, say, has enough power to challenge the U.S., there's also the other point is that it's just still a middle income country. Middle income countries grow faster than higher income countries. So if you just do the projections and you include sort of the demographic information, without any real turnaround in Chinese birth rates, China will still have like twice or three times the economy of the U.S. That's just going to happen unless you get Iglesias's 1 billion Americans. So yeah, it's the country is probably not going to achieve its full potential because it's going to if it gets older, they will there's as far as turning around the birth rate, I think we'll see. The Communist Party of China has really confounded its critics at most points over the last 40 years or so. A lot of people didn't think this growth was possible. I tend to think that it's mostly a cultural thing, the birth rate. So I think if you just have some financial incentives and you don't change the culture, and most democracies can't really change the culture. Singapore's it's not a democracy, but it's something it's something more of an open country. And the Chinese control the internet. They have a pretty advanced surveillance system, and they're highly competent. So we haven't seen this movie before. We haven't seen this tried, and I don't know it'll work or it's not. But I think it's still to be determined.
Yeah. Again, I think you're on the right track. What I like to point out to people is that the last time the United States was not the world's largest economy, at least according to Angus Madison, was like about 1870. And then it was China. So, it's kind of like we're going back to the way it was, although obviously the world is radically different. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Yeah.
I do think the psychological shock of not being number one, though, will have an impact on this country in ways that are going to be hard to understand.
Yeah, objectively, I think the psychological shock should be like high, even more than you say, because you say, well, 1870 China had the largest economy in the world. It's just because it just had so many people. China was not at the cutting edge of science and technology. Now, if you look at patents per capita, it used to be way behind. It's catching up. It's doing amazingly for a middle income country. And you have things like Huawei, where China is just a leader in 5G. It's a leader in a lot of technologies. So it's not like China was like the most technologically advanced or anywhere near it. It was always the West, right? Was the most advanced for the last few hundred years since the Industrial Revolution. And so, or probably even more as far as just like per capita living standards. I don't think it just started with the Industrial Revolution. And so, yeah, but so I think objectively, we're moving towards something different now. China passed the U.S. In GDP as far as purchasing power parity, right? A while ago, I think 5-10 years ago, and that didn't really have a huge psychological effect. I don't think we talk about or think about China that much. So yeah, why can't it pass us on all measures? And we still sort of just keep, talking about Black Lives Matter and critical race theory.
I don't know. People. So PPP is so like what PPC is purchasing power parity, right? And it's like cheaper to live in some countries. Blah blah blah. I think. So that's a talking point that people always make. Bangladesh recently surpassed India in nominal GDP per capita, but its PPP is still lower, and Indians routinely point that out. So I think that's it is a cope, but it's a very plausible and robust cope from what I can tell. They might not even know what PPP means; they just know that they're higher on PPP. That's the key, right? And so I think I think what it's going to impact is not the regular person, because the regular person doesn't keep track of this stuff, but it's going to be on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. It's going to be like a feature in the New York Times when the aggregate GDP nominal gets bigger.
Yeah, it'll be a story. Will it be something that we think about a lot compared to whatever's going on with the equivalent of George Floyd, whatever that is in 5 to 10 years.
So one thing that I'm wondering about is people are wondering, like, what is Richard Hanania's deal? People know that I know you, and I have, you know, there was a period when you were a sub 10,000 Twitter account. I was retweeting you because I thought you were fun and interesting, and now you have your own megaphone, so I don't retweet you as much. But what what is up with the mega contrarianism? Because I don't know what's up with that. People are always asking me, like, what is his deal? What is your deal, Richard?
I mean, it's what is it? I just say what I think. It's just basically, it's I have a few passions. I mean, I've always cared a lot about American foreign policy. I'm concerned about the sort of the cultural trends we're seeing. I dislike bad arguments, whether they're from people on my side or people on the other side. But yeah, I don't feel a need to have like a political home, right? I mean, I don't think it's like secret what I believe on any particular issue. But I mean, I sound like one of these like gender fluid kids, man. I don't need to put a label on it. It's just like that's that's the way I feel. I think I don't think every domain has to be how you feel about every domain and every sort of policy area has to be correlated with everything else, right? I think the foreign policy. I think the left. I mean, the real left, not like the like Rachel Maddow, like oh my god, we love NATO left. I mean, I think like the like the Jill Stein. I wouldn't go. I mean, I'm not endorsing Jill Stein, but the further left is right on foreign policy. I think conservatives are right on a lot of cultural stuff. But a lot of times they don't go far enough. On economic stuff, I'm pretty much non-interventionist in the economy. I think markets work. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any like I don't think there's like anything hidden here. It's just people sort of can't put it together and can't put an easy label on it.
Yeah, I will say many years ago I used to do this thing where I would routinely retweet or tweet out studies that I was skeptical of. And I did that because I'm curious about things that go against my prior so I can improve my understanding of the world. But people assumed it was an endorsement of the study. And so they would kind of express their anger at me. How could I accept such a study? And I would have to say, so what I'm trying to do is tweet out things that I don't always support because I'm just curious about different ideas and I might be wrong and change my view. And I just stopped doing it because I got sick of explaining that to people. Because they just think whatever you tweet out must be what you believe. Sometimes things are just interesting.
Yeah, I agree, and it's sort of like I mean, I'm always interested. A lot of sort of my commentaries, I guess, maybe people can find this interesting or not. It's sort of meta narrative, right? I'm interested in the debate, the debate about the debate, and the way we're framing the debate, right? I'm interested that we're having this discussion about cancel culture, right? And it's just so policy free. That's fascinating to me. I want to figure out something, just sometimes figure out what's going on. Sometimes try to influence it in a more positive direction, right? And yeah, I mean, it's and sometimes you could say, well, I changed my mind on this issue, or I learned more. I was like more of the COVID. I started out on the COVID stuff. I started out very sort of lockdowns. We have to like be very careful. Just the evidence came in, and talking to my friend Philippe Lemoine and his writing, I sort of went to the other side of that. So that just sort of like being willing to look at evidence and sort of update your beliefs over time. I think people appreciate that, or at least some people do.
Well, so I want to close out. I want to ask you then about COVID. As a political social observer, what are the lessons that you've drawn from COVID-19 pandemic and how different nation states and cultures reacted?
I think it's so at the beginning there seemed to be like a simple story. The U.S. was really screwing it up. Over time, basically, like, and also the narrative was Sweden, had sort of got for the herd immunity thing, and they screwed. Over time, though, like they sort of all the countries sort of converged. There was hard in the West, at least, and there was hard to find sort of any large policy difference. And to me, like that Philippe says this too. For to justify lockdowns, you have to have like a huge. It can't save like a few lives or like have a 5 or 10%. If you're gonna like take away people's right to travel, it's got to be a huge, massive fact, not just travel, but socialize and, just live normally, give away a year of your childhood. I mean, that's huge. There's got to be a huge, huge payoff, right? And we just don't see that. Now there was, successes in East Asia. And so, going back to going back to China, I mean, the fact that it came first, whether it was lab leak or not, and people debate that, the fact that it came first and they beat the thing, I mean, is pretty amazing. The so funny about the American sort of getting angry as China is like they hid this information from us, and if only they'd given it to us like a couple of weeks sooner, we would have handled it. And it's just so funny because like we were doing nothing, like we had months and months of warning, and we were doing nothing, and like Trump was still saying, the disease is going to go away any day now, like in June or July, right? So it's like if China had told us 2 weeks before, what was going on, we would have got on top of it. So it's pretty ridiculous. I think the Chinese response was impressive. I think Taiwan and South Korea have also done well. I think it's not. It's probably in many of these cases. I mean, even Japan did well. I think their cases and death rate has gone up recently. So I think Japan has done worse out of the East Asian countries, but still better than pretty much all or all the countries in the West. And I think the culture and behavior matters a lot. I live in Southern California, and masks were normal for Asians out here before COVID. It's just part of the culture to wear masks and being very careful. And a lot of people I know from China or Korea are just super, super careful about COVID. I mean, they're still scared of it. They've been vaccinated, and here where I live, there's barely any deaths anymore. They're still freaked out. So all these things matter. Our institutions, I think didn't do well. I think the public health has been a failure. I think public health should have done is like now it should realize that if the policy doesn't matter much, I mean, I think you should give people the freedom. But like even like with some of them were against. Most of them, according to a poll in the New York Times, like we're against stop wearing masks after you've been vaccinated, like outside. I mean, it's the risk aversion, this the safetyism, the kind of inability to do cost benefit analysis. And I don't know if the American public health establishment is I don't know if it's this bad in other Western countries. This particular aspect of the of COVID, but I just was shocked by it. I changed the mission of CSPI to a more policy focused area, just knowing that epidemiologists have power, right? That just is frightening how bad they are at logic and how bad they are at cost benefit analysis. We've got to do something about it, because another disease could come, and I'm really scared that of these people. It could be half as bad, and they would be recommending the same strict measures or more. Then when you can't do cost benefit analysis, anything is possible. So I think keeping this particular community up. I don't know if there's much that's unique about them. It sort of reminds me, not a lot of people have made this connection, but like to the hysteria about the war on terrorism, like the amount of money and resources we put into stopping terrorism after 9/11, and like not even counting the wars, was just ridiculous. It just was crazy from a cost benefit. Even if you stopped like 4 more 9/11s, there was a book on this by Mueller and Stewart. They just tried to do cost benefit, see if any of the anti-terrorism stuff made sense, and it was just people were just crazy. And it was just like we can't let a single case. We don't care how unpleasant we make air travel. We don't care how hard we make people's lives. We just have to get it down to zero. And so I think it's partly it's just living in a democracy and a sensationalist media. I mean, I think people freak out. I think people develop expertise, but their expertise doesn't make them better thinkers or better do cost benefit analysis. All they can think of is, oh, I'm a terror expert, so all I have to think about is every way we can have terrorism. Or I'm a public health person, and I have to think just about how to maximize public health with no consideration of the economic costs or people's happiness or well-being. And this is a serious problem. And so, yeah, I'm against expertise. I'm against like the way our institutions are working right now. And I think, we just have to try to do things better.
All right. So I'm going to ask you a last question. I was going to ask you this question, but you have been running this think tank for what, a year now?
About, yeah. Not even a year. I think like 9 months or something like that.
So CSPI, which it has an acronym that makes it sound like an I don't know, private espionage operation, and that you are the antagonist in some spy film, CSPI, I don't know. But aside from that, what have you learned then? What have you learned in terms of running an organization like this, having impact, like making a difference?
I think there is, there is an audience out there. There was a point where I thought I wanted to do like the best intellectual work and get the smartest people that that were in the field of that were doing social science work or were talking about important issues. And I thought there might be a trade off between that and sort of our growth. And maybe there is. I mean, if we were just doing complete clickbait stuff and I focused my mind 100 on that, maybe we'd be even getting more impact than we are. But I did realize that it's maybe optimistic that there is an audience out there just for smart smart, data driven analysis of the problems we're facing. So, I mean, the fact that Philippe's article on lockdowns, was in the Wall Street Journal, got to #1. It was covered everywhere. My stuff on civil rights law, it was covered. I think there is a hunger out there for I think for smart analysis, for analysis that's driven not by tribalism, that's realistic, that puts forth solutions when they point out there are problems. Whether that will actually convert to policy influence, we'll still have to see. I think we're thinking more about that. I mean, you have to have not just a sort of theory of what's going wrong and like what you want to see done, but what I try to do in the piece on civil rights laws, try to like have some political commentary and have some kind of blueprint of how you get there in a realistic way. I mean, we consider these things, but yeah, I've learned that that's a optimistic part of what I learned, that people are that there is interest in high quality work. At the same time, I've also realized that talent, and there's also I'll say another thing, there's talent out there, and there's a lot of people out there who would want to be sort of in the public space but don't have anywhere to go. So I've had we're not that huge. I mean, we've been in we've been in a lot of media outlets. We have social media presence, but just like really really smart people who are just undergrads, who are just starting out in grad school, some with real data skills who can do good work, are reaching out to us and say, I'm not I'm not really a person who just comes down on one side of the political aisle, but I think you're doing really smart stuff and I want to be involved. That's inspiring. So I think you can model what you want in the world. I mean, there's tons of people with brains out there. There's tons of people who care about policy, who care about cultural issues, who want to make a difference. If all they see out there is like, partisan bickering or, commentary that's not very intelligent, they're going to be turned off. They're going to go into academia, or they're going to go do something in the private sector, and they're never going to put their, their brains and their work ethic to making the world a better place. So yeah, I think, the importance, and also, and also, I mean, I'll say another thing is, like, I didn't really model myself to be, I mean, I think you could, you call me heterodox, and for my Twitter, I didn't really model myself to like have a niche within conservatism or within liberalism. And sometimes you don't have to do that. I mean, you think like, okay, find your place. Sometimes it's just about being different, and not just different, not different in a bad way, hopefully, but different in a good way. You're doing something that, people will start to trust your objectivity. They'll trust your analytical skills, and you want to bring people along who are also doing that. I don't think this market for what I'm doing, smart commentary that doesn't, that's honest and not trying to, just win points for one side or the other. I don't think that market is anywhere near saturated yet. So people want to be involved with CSPI. They want to do their own thing. Please reach out to me. Twitter's probably the easiest. My DMs are open. But yeah, I mean, I think my experience so far has made me optimistic. I'm not always optimistic on social trends and international affairs and the things I comment on, but my experience so far has made me optimistic about the intellectual culture potentially changing, at least.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good spot to end on. Richard, I enjoy talking to you. I think if the listeners, they like the stuff that I produce, check out his Substack, check out his Twitter. It's always interesting, whether you agree with it or not. And sometimes I'm just like, what is this guy doing? But it's I find it's informationally dense, and there's a lot of stuff to engage with there. I think I do have to observe there's a lot of people out there. I know exactly what they're going to say on all the issues they ever talk about, so I don't really pay attention to them. Like, I have not watched Hannity since the 1990s. You know? Yeah. 1997, I watched Hannity and Combs. That was the last time. I had a roommate who would watch it. And so the reason I don't watch it is like I don't care if he's kind of handsome for a midwit, I just think you know exactly what he's gonna say. He like does the talking point. So I appreciate that you don't do that. You speak your mind. You talk about the truth, and that's what's important. We don't have enough people like that in the world right now. It's not that people lie, but they hold their tongue.
Yeah.
Okay. And I like that you don't hold your tongue all the time. I mean, sometimes it's prudent to hold your tongue a little bit of the time.
Yeah,
But,
what I tell people is you want to be brave, but if you like, say you're in a war and you're just like running into machine gun fire, you don't want to do that. You want to be a brave.
Yeah. Unless you're Gal Gadot.
Yeah, so
Gal Gadot, you can pull that off. You can pull that off. All right, Richard. It was great talking to you. I will see you online, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Razib. It was fun. Thanks.